Hello and welcome back to The Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 106 called Muhammad's Revolution. In this and future episodes, we'll address one of the greatest enigmas in history. How did Islam rise from obscure origins in Western Arabia to transform and dominate world history in a matter of a few decades? It's a subject still keenly debated by historians, and many different theories exist, and we'll be looking at all the evidence and the different scholarly views to come up with an answer that makes sense. So, in the last episode, we left the Roman Emperor Heraclius celebrating his victory over Persia and the return of the True Cross to Jerusalem in AD 630. That same year was also significant for another man, a religious and political leader in Western Arabia named Muhammad, since it was the year he conquered Mecca and established a radical new state in the heart of ancient Arabia, a state that would transform world history and whose religion is still worshipped by some 1.8 billion people, or around a quarter of the world's population. That religion is, of course, Islam. And in this episode, I want to look at just how Muhammad forged this new Islamic state. And to do that, we need to go back before Muhammad was born in around 575 to consider what ancient Arabia was like. To start in the south, the most powerful kingdom in the whole of Arabia was that of Himyar, based in what is today modern Yemen. The climate in this region is much wetter than in the dry Arabian desert and supported agriculture, including producing grain, fruit and vegetables sufficient to feed a sedentary population and to export its produce throughout Arabia. An impressive irrigation system of dams, water channels and cisterns was constructed over hundreds of years, including a huge dam at Marib in northern Yemen, measuring over 15 metres in height and half a kilometre in length, the remains of which are still clearly visible today. The kingdom of Himyar provided the Romans with most of their frankincense and myrrh, both extracted from trees specific to that region, and it also controlled much of the sea trade with India, with large quantities of spices and ivory imported from India to the west. Writing in the 1st century AD, Pliny the Elder described it as, quote, one of the richest nations in the world. Religiously, Himyar was influenced by the major religions around it, principally Judaism and Christianity. By the 4th century AD, for reasons that have never become clear, its kings converted to Judaism. But the possibility that the Arab world could have become Jewish instead of Muslim was curtailed by invasion from the Ethiopian kingdom of Aksum across the Red Sea, who were recent converts to Christianity. Aksum extended its control over Himyar by 530, making it an important addition to the lands of Christendom, much to the Emperor Justinian's excitement. But he couldn't stop a Himyarite counter-coup against Aksum supported by the Persians. Although Himyar recovered its independence, the price was subservience to Persia, so that the whole of southern Arabia was effectively under Persian control by the time Muhammad was born in around 575. It's long been a mystery why a powerful Arab state like Himyar collapsed in the 6th century, but new research by paleoclimatologists points to what might at least be part of the answer in the form of a severe period of drought in the first half of the 6th century. By taking a cross-section of a stalagmite from the Hoti cave in present-day Oman, boring holes into it and extracting uranium samples for isotope analysis, it's possible to draw conclusions about annual rainfall amounts. The research team showed conclusively that not only did less rain fall during the 6th century, but there must have been an extreme drought in its early part, and it's now looking likely that Himyar was a victim of natural climatic volatility. Ultimately, Himyar's decline was Persia's gain. But, as we'll soon discuss, it would also be very much to the benefit of a new and embryonic religion, Islam, that was developing in the power vacuum that Himyar's collapse left. So let's look at the political structure of Arabia outside Himyar at the time of Muhammad's birth in around 575. And I think it was probably a little like that of ancient Germania, as first encountered by Julius Caesar in the 1st century BC. Caesar recorded there were many different tribes all fighting each other. As such, they posed a minor threat to Rome since they were preoccupied with their own internecine conflict, and to his mind they were too poor and too warlike to be worth conquering. So he halted his legions at the Rhine. In a similar vein, the Romans and Persians had historically halted their interest in Arabia at its northern desert borders and shown little interest in the goings-on within the vast empty deserts of Arabia Major. We have almost no records about ancient Arabia, but what little we have points to a situation similar, I think, to that of ancient Germania, i.e. large numbers of autonomous tribes preoccupied with fighting each other. In Arabia's case, its nomadic tribes weren't herding cattle through dense forests, but jealously guarding their network of oases to extract water for themselves and their livestock. Since time immemorial, their lifestyle had been anarchic, without law or administration, and reliant on long-forgotten political codes for sharing water and territory. Settled populations existed primarily in the more fertile south, such as we've just discussed with Himyar, but some of the larger oases in western and eastern Arabia had enough water to support larger settled populations. And in the western segment, two settlements would acquire huge historical significance: Mecca and Medina, or Yathrib in Arabic. It is to Mecca we must now turn, and to a very remarkable man born there in around 575, Muhammad. To understand his life, we need to appreciate what an unusual and special place ancient Mecca was. Long before Muhammad's birth, it was an important religious centre. At some point in history, now long forgotten, it had acquired the status of a haram, or sanctuary. Harams were important in pre-Islamic Arabia as neutral areas where the Arab tribes could meet and trade in peace. They often had their origins in both a favourable location, situated between tribal territories, and an association with a holy man. This holy man provided an invaluable service to the society of ancient Arabia, since he could act as an arbitrator in tribal disputes, provided he was seen as truly unbiased and objective. He could make a living by taking payment in exchange for maintaining the peace and sanctity of the site, as well as providing food and lodgings to those visiting. In this way, harams played a vital role in a society without laws, without law courts, without police, and without accepted religious practices. They remind me a little of what archaeologists now believe was the purpose of the Forum in ancient Rome in its earliest days. For example, in prehistory, in the period between, say, 1000 and 750 BC, when Rome's 7 hills were each claimed by a separate tribe, the marshy lowland between those hills, where the Forum came to be sited, served as a meeting place for the tribes where they could trade, discuss disputes, and join together in worshipping deities. As such, the early Forum served an important social function in ensuring cooperation and a sense of community. Essential to both the ancient Forum and the harams was that their locations were sacred, places that couldn't be polluted with bloodshed. In other words, people were safe there. Mecca became one of the most famous of all the harams in Arabia, a well-established holy place where nomads could meet, trade, and settle disputes. It was located in a barren landscape where no agriculture was practiced, so that food had to be imported. However, it did have several wells to provide water, including the famous and sacred well of Zamzam. And most importantly, it lay between the lands inhabited by several nomadic tribes. In the 6th century, Mecca's reputation for holding trade fairs grew, and it became a thriving trading centre. Into this vibrant society, Muhammad was born, according to Islamic sources written centuries later, as a member of the Hashim clan, part of the Quraysh tribe that ruled Mecca. His father died a few months before he was born, and his mother died when he was only 6 years old, leaving him an orphan who was looked after by his paternal grandfather and then his uncle. Our sources say he was a merchant, which would have been entirely normal in Mecca, which, as I mentioned, was a thriving trading centre. Islamic sources are brief about the details of his boyhood, recording the most significant event as his marriage to a wealthy Qurayshi widow, Khadija. That marriage brought him financial security, children, and a partner who supported him as long as she lived. She died in around 619. Although our sources say he was regarded as an honest and reputable merchant, there was nothing to suggest he'd become the founder of one of the world's greatest religions, except possibly for his habit of seeking solitude for meditation and reflection. However, it's important to appreciate this wasn't that unusual in Mecca, which was the most important religious centre in Western Arabia. But in 610, when he was about 40 years old, as he was meditating in the cave of Hira outside Mecca, the Archangel Gabriel visited him and required him to recite the first verse or surah of what would later be compiled into the Quran. Muhammad was initially reluctant to utter the verses, but at Gabriel's insistence he found he could say, quote, "Recite in the name of thy Lord who created. He created man from a clot of blood. Recite, and thy Lord is the most bountiful. He who taught by the pen taught man what he knew not." End quote. When he left the cave, Muhammad heard a voice above him, telling him he was the messenger of God, and he'd spoken with Gabriel. Terrified by the entire experience, Muhammad fled from the cave to tell his wife, who was convinced he was a prophet sent from God. She was the first of several converts to his cause, which initially included only a small following of his relatives and some friends, such as another merchant, Abu Bakr, who would later play a prominent role in Islam's expansion after Muhammad's death. In around 613, Muhammad began to preach about his revelations and convert people in Mecca to become his followers. His focus was on communicating the imminence of the last day of judgment and the need for people to believe in one true God, Allah. As his reputation for preaching grew, like so many revolutionaries, he found both support and opposition. Support mainly came from the poorer people dissatisfied with their lot, and opposition from the rich and powerful, in this case the dominant Quraysh tribe in Mecca. They regarded him as a threat to their authority and began to persecute him. This persecution intensified after the Persian conquest of Jerusalem in 614, which was a serious blow to Christianity's reputation. It should be remembered that Muhammad regarded Christian and Jewish teaching as an integral part of his new faith. He was the last in a long line of prophets, beginning with Adam and including Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Therefore, the triumph of Persian Zoroastrianism over Christianity would have been a blow. In 615, many of his followers abandoned Mecca and fled across the Red Sea to the Christian Ethiopian kingdom of Aksum. In 622, the persecution caused Muhammad and all his followers to leave Mecca for Medina, in what has become known as the Hijra, or emigration. This was a turning point. Most historians date the beginning of Islam from this moment. We still don't know why Medina was so much more receptive to Muhammad's teaching than Mecca, but for whatever reason, he was welcomed as the political chief of the town, and a set of documents relating to this time, known as the Constitution of Medina, preserved in an early 9th century Muslim text, describe the principles of the first Islamic state. These consisted of three key concepts that would prove to be the basis of a world religion and a world revolution. First, Muhammad's believers formed a unique community called the Ummah, which superseded all other political, religious and family ties. Hitherto, Arab society had been tribal first and religious second. The tribe had been the most important political unit, and religious choice was either made by the tribe or left to its members. But the Ummah was a community of believers who transcended all other kinship and political groups. It was open to anyone who believed in Muhammad's teachings, so creating the possibility of a world religion. Second, the Ummah existed to follow the one true God, Allah. All other gods were banished. It was also extremely relevant that, unlike Jesus, Muhammad himself was not God. He was merely God's messenger. The Muslim mantra became, quote, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the apostle of God." This meant Islam rejected the Christian concept of the Holy Trinity, with Jesus as both divine but also human, which had caused such division within the Christian Roman Empire between Monophysites and Chalcedonians. And I think this was crucial to the later acceptance of Islam by many of the Monophysite populations of the Roman Empire, and it's a subject we'll return to in future episodes. Third, worship of one all-powerful God gave the Ummah the right to establish a working government. This meant that the hitherto lawless Arab society, which had never previously been able to establish the apparatus of an effective government above tribal level, i.e. a unified legal code, taxation, military service, and other forms of social harmonization, things the Romans had been so spectacularly good at doing, was suddenly provided with the possibility of doing just this in the name of Allah. But Muhammad's new state in Medina was nearly crushed even before it got going. The Quraysh in Mecca were simply not going to accept him. In response, he plundered some of their caravans and provoked a war. An initial victory for Muhammad's followers at the Battle of Badr in 624 prompted a major Meccan onslaught. They defeated his forces at Uhud in 625 and laid siege to Medina, but were beaten in the Battle of the Trench in 627, when Muhammad allegedly constructed a trench defending the northern approach to Medina, the rest of the town being closed off to attack by mountains. His followers manned the trench and prevented the larger Meccan force, helped by nomadic tribesmen, from crossing. The Meccans retreated, and Muhammad spent the next 2 years building up his authority with the nomadic tribes in the region. For example, if they converted to Islam, he promised them a share of the spoils in battles and raids against non-believers, and he gave them the receipt of tax revenues. He also cemented ties with new tribes through marriage. His first wife, Khadija, died in 619, and while they were monogamous for 25 years, thereafter he reputedly married at least 10 other women, it seems for political purposes, a practice that wasn't unusual for leaders at the time. By 630, he had enough political support from the tribes surrounding Mecca to leave it beleaguered and vulnerable to attack. In that year, he led a force of some 10,000 believers to the city, which capitulated with no serious fighting. His conquest of the city became the template for Islamic expansion in the next few decades. There was no violence, no slaughter of the pagans. Instead, Muhammad extended the hand of friendship, provided Mecca's inhabitants either converted, as most did, or agreed to recognize the authority of the Ummah. He showed particular tolerance towards his long-held enemy, the Quraysh clan, who were welcomed into the Ummah, often being given senior roles as military commanders, governors, or close advisors. He was keen to ensure no grudges were harboured against him or his believers. He destroyed the pagan deities in Mecca's sacred sanctuary, the Kaaba, which is, of course, today Islam's most important holy site, and towards which Muslims pray. After incorporating Mecca into the heart of his Islamic state, Muhammad spent the next 2 years before his unexpected death in June 632 expanding his new state to the north and south of the Arabian Peninsula. To the south, he subdued the nomadic tribe, the Banu Hawazin, at the Battle of the Hunain Valley. Further south, the important town of Taif capitulated in 631 after initially resisting his attack in 630. By the time of his death, he'd established a strong Arab state along the coastline of western Arabia, equivalent in size and resources to the kingdom of Himyar in the far south of Arabia, which, as I mentioned earlier, was the most powerful Arab state before the rise of Islam. So, in conclusion, how are we to understand Muhammad's true motivation and intention? It's worth noting, I think, that he wasn't the only prophet in his time. Mecca was a religious centre which produced other prophets, although none succeeded in the way he did. I think he must have had a genuine belief in himself as a messenger of God. Great political and religious leaders aren't normally cynics who can feign religious or political devotion. The key to their success normally lies in their genuine self-belief, which transmits an infectious enthusiasm to their followers. So it was, I suggest, with Muhammad. And essential to his vision was not only a new religion, but a new form of centralized state. Belief in Allah transcended the tribal and dynastic allegiances that had long dominated ancient Arabia. His last years were spent developing new centralized legal systems, in particular clarifying the rights of landowners and eradicating the lawlessness of nomadic land tenure arrangements. He appointed governors and tax collectors. Meanwhile, in faraway Constantinople and Ctesiphon, as Rome and Persia fought the last war of antiquity, they scarcely noticed the emergence of Muhammad's embryonic Islamic state. In 630, the Emperor Heraclius thought he was the undisputed master of Western Eurasia. But in the next few years, he would face one of the most powerful movements ever to arise on planet Earth. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll continue with the extraordinary story of the rise of Islam and the end of the ancient world in 2 weeks' time on the 15th of February. And in the meantime, if you're looking for something to read, I strongly recommend my new book on Justinian's turbulent reign called Justinian's Empire, link in the show notes. And as ever, a shout out to German listeners that the first book in my series, called The Roman Revolution, is now published in German, Die Römische Revolution, and you can find it on amazon.de. Again, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.